There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when one must relinquish the frantic desire to fix, to solve, to act, not out of laziness or despair, but because something deeper has begun to stir. Most people will miss this moment. They will drown it in noise, in activity, in the thousand distractions of the outer world. The ego is the part of the psyche that we most readily identify with. It is the I that speaks when we say, I want, I think, or I need. It gives us a sense of coherence and continuity, allowing us to navigate the world with purpose and direction. However, while the ego is essential for functioning in daily life, it also has a deeply rooted tendency to overreach. It seeks control, not just over external circumstances, but also over the internal terrain of thought, emotion, and instinct. This compulsion to control stems from a basic insecurity. The ego knows, even if only dimly, that it is not the whole of the personality. It is a fragment, a small light surrounded by a vast darkness, the unconscious, and so it fears surrender. It fears being overwhelmed by forces it cannot understand or command. This fear leads the ego into a perpetual struggle. It clings to plans, to explanations, to actions, believing that movement equals mastery. But in reality, much of this activity is driven by anxiety. The ego feels threatened by ambiguity, silence, and inaction, so it responds with noise, urgency, and overcommitment. It fills the space that might otherwise allow insight to emerge. It talks over the inner voice. It interrupts the natural unfolding of the psyche's deeper wisdom. This kind of interference is often mistaken for strength. We are taught to be proactive, to fix problems as soon as they arise, to push forward no matter the cost. But in doing so, we frequently block the very forces that could bring healing, clarity, or transformation. In dreams and symbols, the unconscious often depicts the ego as a character that is lost, wandering, or trapped. These images are not cruel, they are invitations. They reveal the limitation of the ego's perspective. They show that control is often a form of blindness. When the ego believes it knows what is best, it becomes deaf to the subtle cues of the deeper self. It resists change that does not originate from its own will. It rejects possibilities that do not fit into its pre-existing narratives. As a result, many people live confined within a narrow band of experience, repeating the same patterns, suffering the same wounds, and wondering why nothing seems to change. The ego's compulsion to control is not only a psychological issue, it is also a spiritual one. At its core, it is a refusal to trust life. It is the belief that only conscious intention can bring order or meaning, but life is not a mechanism to be dominated. It is an unfolding process rich with mystery and complexity. The unconscious, far from being chaotic or dangerous, holds the potential for profound order. It is a source of dreams, intuition, creativity, and symbolic insight. When given space, it can guide the personality toward greater wholeness. But it cannot be coerced. It cannot be summoned at will. It responds to invitation, not demand. There are moments in every person's life when the strategies of the ego begin to fail. These moments can feel like breakdowns, crises, or losses of identity. But from another perspective, they are initiations. They mark the beginning of a descent away from surface certainties and toward the hidden layers of the self. In such moments, the ego's usual methods, problem solving, rationalization, distraction, become ineffective. The more one tries to control the situation, the worse it becomes. It is precisely here that the possibility of transformation emerges. If the ego can relinquish its need to dominate, something else can begin to move. A new attitude can form, one that is receptive rather than aggressive, listening rather than dictating. This shift does not mean the ego disappears. It means it learns its proper place. It becomes a servant of the deeper self rather than its master. This reorientation is not easy. It often involves fear, confusion, and a sense of helplessness. But these experiences are not signs of failure. They are signs that the old mode of functioning is no longer sufficient. They indicate that a new center is trying to emerge, one that is more integrated, more balanced, and more aligned with the totality of the psyche. In practical terms, this means learning to recognize when action is being driven by fear rather than wisdom. It means pausing before reacting, allowing space for a deeper knowing to surface. It means honoring the rhythms of the unconscious, its dreams, its symbols, its moods, even when they do not make immediate sense. It means resisting the temptation to fix everything at once, to rush toward closure, to impose solutions from the outside. It means cultivating patience, humility, and trust. None of this is easy in a culture that prizes speed, control, and productivity. The ego is constantly reinforced by societal values that equate activity with worth, but the psyche does not care about these values. It cares about truth, depth, and balance. It will not be rushed. It will not yield to force. It moves according to its own logic, its own timing, its own need. When the ego learns to respect this, a different kind of power becomes available, not the power to manipulate or dominate, but the power to align with a force much greater than oneself. This force does not speak in commands or formulas. It speaks in images and feelings, in quiet intuitions. It cannot be harnessed, but it can be followed. It does not answer every question, but it brings a kind of knowing that is deeper than explanation. It is a movement of the self, the totality of the psyche, drawing the ego into a larger orbit. When the ego accepts its role within this greater whole, life begins to reorganize itself. Conflicts begin to resolve not through force, but through understanding. Obstacles dissolve not because they are defeated, but because they are no longer necessary. The world outside may not change, but the inner world begins to fall into place. There is a peculiar wisdom in withdrawing from the clamor of life, in stepping back not as an escape, but as a deliberate gesture of psychological openness. To withdraw is not to abandon responsibility or collapse into passivity. Rather, it is to create a space where something older, deeper, and more authentic may emerge from the interior of the psyche. Much of what we call thinking is merely the ego circling its own limited understanding, trying to force solutions that the unconscious has already outgrown. The compulsion to act, to respond, to intervene, is often a form of resistance to what the psyche already knows, but has not yet brought into awareness. The wisdom of withdrawal lies in trusting that the silence we fear may in fact be the very ground in which transformation is cultivated. In a world that worships motion, silence is heresy. We are trained to be ceaseless in our efforts to equate rest with failure and stillness with irrelevance. This conditioning seeps into our inner life. We begin to believe that if we are not constantly solving our problems or actively working toward a goal, we are falling behind or letting something crucial slip away. But the soul does not obey the same rhythms as the marketplace. It does not measure growth in terms of productivity or efficiency. The deeper currents of the psyche move in slow, spiraling patterns, often invisible until they have already begun to change us. To live in harmony with these movements, one must be willing to wait, to let things gestate, to allow the unknown to ripen without premature interference. The unconscious speaks in images, impulses, and dreams, none of which respond well to force. They cannot be commanded or manipulated without distortion. When one constantly intervenes, trying to direct the course of events or impose clarity before its time, the unconscious retreats. It seals itself off, not out of malice, but because it cannot thrive under surveillance. It requires trust. It requires a willingness to dwell in uncertainty, to sit with confusion, to tolerate ambiguity without rushing toward resolution. In this sense, The act of doing nothing becomes an offering, an act of faith in the wisdom of the unseen. The modern individual has become so entangled in external obligations and internal anxieties that the possibility of non-action feels dangerous. To stop moving is to risk exposure to what lies beneath the surface of conscious thought. But it is only by pausing, by creating a psychic stillness, that one can begin to hear what has long been silenced. The psyche is like a lake, muddied by storms of fear and compulsion. Only when the winds die down and the waters are left undisturbed can the reflection of the deeper self appear with clarity. And in that reflection, truths emerge, truths that could never be grasped through mere effort. There are times when the best course is to do nothing, not because there is no action to take, but because the right action has not yet revealed itself. Premature movement is often a form of self-sabotage. It disrupts the organic unfolding of inner processes. It confuses noise with necessity. But when one holds back, not out of paralysis, but out of reverence for the unknown, something begins to gather strength within. A quiet center forms. This center is not imposed by the ego that arises from the depths, from the same place where dreams originate. It brings with it a sense of coherence that is not constructed, but discovered. The paradox is that this withdrawal, this refusal to interfere, often sets in motion a series of changes more profound than any deliberate strategy could achieve. The psyche, when left to its own intelligence, begins to align. Pieces that once seemed scattered or contradictory find their proper place. Conflicts lose their charge. Desires clarify themselves. What once felt urgent may dissolve altogether, replaced by a deeper sense of direction. This is not magic. It is psychological law. The unconscious has a tendency toward wholeness. It seeks integration, but it cannot complete its work while the ego continues to impose its narrow will. By choosing non-action at the right moment, one steps aside and allows this process to occur. It is not the giving up, but the giving over to something wiser, something more whole. The individual does not vanish in this act. On the contrary, a more authentic self begins to take form. This self is not built through achievement or analysis. It is born through surrender, through the quiet acceptance of what is. It does not arrive with fanfare or certainty. It emerges slowly like a figure coming into focus in the mist. This wisdom of withdrawal has been known to ancient traditions, often hidden behind the metaphors of descent, darkness, or retreat. In myth, the hero must often leave the known world, enter the cave, the underworld, the belly of the whale. These images are not mere stories. They speak to a psychological truth that growth often requires us to step away from our usual roles and expectations. In the silence of withdrawal, the false selves begin to loosen. The persona, the mask we wear to navigate society, starts to crack. Beneath it, the true face begins to emerge, one that is not designed but discovered. The moment we stop trying to force the narrative, we become available to receive it. The psyche, like nature, abhors emptiness. When we do nothing, we are not creating a void, but a vessel. Into that vessel flows meaning, insight, transformation. But we must be willing to wait. We must trust that the emptiness is not a lack, but a preparation. It is the fertile ground in which the seed of the self may take root. Unlike all seeds, it does not respond to haste. It must be left alone, in darkness, with nothing to disturb its slow becoming. To do nothing is to risk the collapse of the ego's illusion of control. But it is also to open the door to something greater than control, alignment. In this alignment, we no longer act out of compulsion, but from a quiet knowing. We no longer seek to dominate life, but to participate in its unfolding. This participation is not marked by busyness or noise, but by presence, a still, attentive presence that allows things to become what they were meant to be. without interference or distortion. It is in this state of non-action that the psyche begins to show us what we could not see before. It speaks not in commands, but in symbols, not in noise, but in silence. And if we are listening, truly listening, we find that what we thought needed fixing never needed fixing at all. It only needed space to become itself. And so you are not being asked to abandon life, nor to retreat forever into stillness, but to trust that stepping back, even momentarily, can allow a deeper order to emerge. When the ego releases its grip, when the need to interfere softens, the unconscious begins to arrange things in ways the rational mind could never anticipate. Doing nothing in the right moment is not defeat. It is alignment with the hidden architecture of the psyche. It is an act of trust in the life that breathes beneath your plans. Watch, and you will see the most important things fall into place when you stop trying to hold them together. Thank you for taking the time to listen with openness. May your stillness become your strength and your surrender your doorway to clarity. Good luck on the path ahead. And remember, even in silence, something ancient and wise is always moving toward you.